Today, we're going to actually start in Camera Raw. You know why? Because whenever I teach a class like this, we do Camera Raw at the very beginning. And then it seems like we never use it again afterwards, and people think of it as like a separate thing. All the things we talk about throughout all the days, there's usually a component within Camera Raw. So I want to cover some of the things that we didn't have time to cover during the other ones because they're very important. And then we'll also look at some of the creative techniques we can use, some of the retouching, that type of stuff that we're planning on doing today. The other things we're going to cover today are retouching, creative effects, and finishing techniques. Just stuff we have to do if we're going to send our files off to other people, because not everything's obvious. Like, should I sharpen my image? When should I sharpen my image? How much? Anything to worry about when I do that? That kind of stuff. So anyway, we got a lot to cover. Starting off Camera Raw, doing retouching, creative effects, and finishing techniques. Let's jump in, get going. So in Camera Raw, do you remember when we had a series of images with horses? Very first images we worked with. Some of those images, when we first looked at them, were really dark. And then afterwards, we processed some images that were from Iceland that were really dark as well. And when we brightened them up, one thing I mentioned was the noise is hiding in the dark portion of your image. And anytime you brighten up the dark part of the image to make it easy to see what was in there, and it used to be so dark you couldn't see it, part of the detail that you're getting is the noise that was in there. So we need to think about how to deal with that. So in this case, what I'm going to do is zoom in to 100% view. Don't know if you remember or not, but there's a very quick way of doing that. And what it is you double click on the zoom tool in the upper left of my screen. That'll get me to 100% view, and then I can use the hand tool to move around. And when I do that, I can see a very noisy looking image, especially if you look at her leg. It looks like she's got some, I don't know, either mega hairy leg or something, but it's noise in there. So to deal with that, we have a bunch of tabs over here in Camera Raw. We've only dealt with maybe 2 of those tabs. Let's take a look at a few of the others. This one right here is known as the Detail tab. And in the Detail tab, we have things related to sharpening and noise reduction. And sharpening is actually very important when it comes to noise. Because with default settings, if you look at it, here are the defaults, it is sharpening your picture. Because if your picture came from a digital camera, it usually is just slightly soft when it comes in. And part of the reason for that is the majority of digital cameras out there have actually a filter in front of the sensor that somewhat softens the image. You might think that would be a bad thing. Why would you possibly do that? But if you don't, because of the way the sensor is built, if you had fabrics and other things that have patterns in them, like the weave of fabric, you can get a moire pattern. If you're not familiar with a moire pattern, have you ever seen it where you take 2 screens like you'd have in a screen door and you rotate them slightly, you get this weird pattern going up? That's a moire pattern. And you get some of that stuff happening in the weave of fabric and other things if you don't have that filter in front. But it makes your image slightly soft. And so here we're just trying to compensate for the slightly soft image our camera gives us. And this is the default setting. Well, the problem with it is there is a slider down here at the bottom called masking. And that slider, if we bring it up, would cause this to not sharpen the entire picture, but to only sharpen it where there's more obvious detail and not where there's subtle detail. Well, the default setting for that is 0. What that means is don't limit where this image is sharpened at all. And so that means if we have an area, like over here, where there is no what I would call useful detail, meaning, can you see hairs on her leg? Can you see, anything when it comes to the detail of her leg right there? Sure, I can see where she's wearing some jewelry down here, but not up in this area here. And so if this is not useful detail, instead it's noise, it doesn't make sense to me to sharpen it. Because sharpening is going to exaggerate it, make it easier to see, make it jump off the image more. So what I want to do first is to make sure that the sharpening is only applying where there's really useful detail, where there's stuff where whatever's in there, the detail that's there, is something I actually want you to pay attention to. So I'm going to zoom out on this picture. I'll double click on my hand tool to get to 100% view, and I'm going to adjust the masking setting. Now the problem is when you bring up masking, it's really hard to tell when it stops sharpening the really noisy areas and only concentrates on the useful detail. But there's a hidden feature in here that can show us exactly where it will sharpen our image and where it won't. What that is the masking slider. When I click on it, I'm going to hold down the Option key. That's the Alt key in Windows. If I don't hold it down, when I bring it up, it's really hard to tell what it's doing. But if I hold down the Option key and keep it held down, then when I click, it changes my view of the picture. Right now, it's showing me a mask, like a layer mask. It's just a mask within Camera Raw. And remember with masks, if the mask is white, it means let this layer show up, if it was a layer mask. Well, this means let the sharpening show up. And if I bring this slider up, do you see how black starts being introduced in a mask? And you remember how in a layer mask, if you paint with black, it hides whatever's in that layer? Well, in this case, it's hiding the sharpening. It means it's not going to sharpen those areas that are turning black. As I bring this higher and higher and higher, you see more and more of the image turning black. Well, those black areas are the parts that won't be sharpened. So what I want to do is just glance at the picture and try to remember overall where there is areas that don't contain useful detail, or useful is not the right word. My brain isn't attached to the right word right now. Just detail that is important, or detail that you would want to actually emphasize. So for instance, up here in the sky, that little corner of the sky, there's nothing in there that is truly detailed that I would care if it was prominent or not. Right here, the edge of those clouds, that's useful detail. That's something where, yeah, I want you to be able to tell that the edge of the clouds are there, that kind of stuff. But in between these clouds, not really detailed. If I look at the horse itself, there's not much detail in the dark portion of the horse. It's where the edges of the hair are that is detailed. It's where this whitish area on the front touches the darker area. That's detail. So what I'm going to do is just try to remember where there wasn't much useful detail. And I'm going to bring up the masking until those areas turn black. So up in the sky, getting those areas now to turn black. And you see it on the body of the horse, these kind of almost random white squiggles in it. I'm going to bring it up until those random white squiggles start to turn black. Let's say there. But if you look at it, you notice that the edge of the mane of the horse still has the white stuff on it, meaning it will still be sharpened. And you notice that part on the front of the horse's head where it had a lighter color to it, that has white stuff on it. It will still be sharpened. But the horse itself now will largely not get sharpened. And if I want to push it further, if you look at her leg, it still has some white on her leg. I could keep going and see if I can get it to largely get off of her leg, about like there maybe. I'm starting to get it where it's mainly off the leg. It still, though, has some on the mane of the horse where it droops down, like by his eye, that kind of thing, and things. But anyway, by doing this, getting it up this high, now we're not sharpening the noise. So I'm not going to do that in every single image necessarily. It's the images where I had an image that was overly dark, and I brightened it up, and in doing so, noise became prominent, became easy to see, and I hate the noise. Well, then we don't want to exaggerate the noise by sharpening it. So we need to do something to get the sharpening out of there. And masking is what's going to do that. Then below that, we have areas for noise reduction. So first, we make sure we're not exaggerating the noise with our sharpening. And second, we try to reduce or eliminate the noise. So let's double click on the zoom tool again to get up to 100% view. And let's move around. And let's see if we can reduce our noise. So we have two kinds of noise reduction. One is luminance noise reduction. Luminance is just a fancy word for brightness. And then we have color. And there's two different kinds of noise we can have. With default settings, you'll find that the color setting is turned up because most cameras produce a lot of color noise. And if you bring it down, you'd see it. Can you see that it looks like what I call Christmas lights? Because it's randomly colored kind of specks. Well, most cameras deliver a good amount of that. And so the default setting, if I double click on the slider called color, I don't know if you remember or not, but in Camera Raw, double clicking on any slider will reset it to its default. But it's usually high enough to largely eliminate most of that. But if you had some extreme noise, color noise, you might need to adjust this. So if I bring it down too far, I see what I call Christmas tree lights. And I bring it up, bring it up. If you bring it up too far, then what can happen is where you have true detail in your image. Let's say you have somebody with a shirt on that's multicolored, and there's small little blobs of color within their shirt. It won't know the difference between that and noise, and it will start blending into the surrounding colors. So we don't want to just crank this up, if we have detail in our picture that involves changes in color, like somebody's busy shirt they might be wearing. So I can bring this up and get it till the little specks of color start to blend in with their surroundings. Oops, wrong one. Bring up color. Then there's another slider, because sometimes even doing that, which is designed for getting rid of kind of little specks of color, isn't enough, because you'll have kind of patchiness to the color. Can you see, I don't know if you can easily see this on the broadcast because of the compression that's applied, but right here is like a yellowish blob to me, like a bigger one. There's a kind of magenta-ish hint right here. There's just kind of blobby in the look of the color when I look at it on my screen. Not sure if you guys can see it on the broadcast or on other things because it's very subtle. But if you see it on your pictures when you're adjusting things, and it's not little specks, which is what the color noise looks like, it's blobs, like the size of your thumb showing up. Then there's a choice here called color smoothness. And if you increase it, it will usually smooth those out. Let me see if I can bring it down, and it might emphasize it. But I can more easily see a yellow blob here, magenta blob there, greenish blob here. And bringing up color smoothness works more with those larger, I'll call them blobules. So we can try to reduce or eliminate it. But again, be careful. If you bring this up too high, you're going to find the general color detail in your picture, the important true detail, has nothing to do with noise, might start to look more grayish, where it's blending in with the surroundings. So be careful. Then we have, that's color noise. We can talk about luminance noise, which is just brightness noise. That means specks that vary in brightness instead of color. And with that, I can bring this up and start to reduce or eliminate it. But there are two other sliders related to it that are interacting with this slider. There's one here called luminance detail. And if you have an overly noisy image, not an average image, but one where you started off with something really dark and you made an extreme adjustment to brighten it, and that's usually when you get extreme noise showing up, what I would do when I'm adjusting this is, before I even mess with the slider called luminance, take this slider called luminance detail, turn it down to 0. That just turns that setting off, so it's not affecting the image. We'll talk about what the setting does in a moment, but with that turned up, you're not getting the full effect of the top slider. You have something in there that is not showing you the full effect. So now I can move this around to see what is actually the highest setting I would want to use for this image. This is with none. I see quite a bit of noise. And then I bring it up, and I got to decide, am I going to try to completely eliminate it? Because if I do, oftentimes you get a really soft looking image. It's a matter of a good balance between the image not becoming too soft and the image not having too much noise. You got to find a good in between. So I'm going to come in here and see, I think right about in there, I'm starting to get to a point where I'm not minding the noise as much. It's not something that's bothering me. But in doing so, there's nothing right now trying to prevent the same thing happening to the real detail in the picture. So the real detail in the picture will start looking soft at this point. And that's where the slider called luminance detail comes in. When it's turned all the way down, it's not trying to differentiate detail from noise. It's thinking they're both the same. We're just softening our picture. Now when I bring the luminance detail up, it's trying to make that noise reduction only happen where it thinks there's noise. And the way I would deal with that in extreme cases, like I'm talking about here, is I would crank it as high as it goes, and then I'd slowly bring it down and find the highest setting that makes the image look realistic. Because what'll happen is you're going to get weird, artificial looking kind of swirls in your image where the noise used to be, because it's acting as if there's detail there and trying to retain it. And you want to bring it up until you find the highest setting that doesn't give you weird looking stuff, like your noise reduction still kicking in where the noise is, and somewhere down in there. Because now, before, I know it's very hard to see on the feed because anytime you have noise, it compresses the feed in order to send it out, and in doing so, things like noise and really fine detail are really hard to discern. So I'm not sure how useful this is for you to look at it, but in general, if you ever have extreme amount of noise, the way I would suggest you dealing with it is take this thing called luminance detail, turn it all the way down, just to turn it off. Then adjust your luminance until you've reduced the amount of noise to a level that you think that's what you want to go for. And then to try to get as much true detail back in your image, crank the luminance detail all the way up and then slowly bring it down until things look natural. Because when it's cranked all the way up, the areas that were overly noisy usually will have weird swirly little stuff, almost like it'll look like you took a pen and started doodling in there. And you want to bring it down until these areas look natural. There is something called luminance contrast. You'll find that on the vast majority of images that you have, it won't seem to do anything. But on some images, you will find that it will bring some contrast back into the dark portions of your image so that if I come over here and look maybe at the horse's head, things, if I adjust, I suppose I don't need to zoom up so far, the luminance contrast, you will see some additional contrast coming into those dark areas. It will be rather subtle though, and that can be a way to emphasize the detail that's there. But you're going to find on a huge number of images, it won't seem to do anything. So when it comes to noise, first thing we think about is sharpening. Don't exaggerate it unnecessarily. So there was a slider called masking, and I bring it up. I use that masking slider on a huge number of images, just so you know, even if they don't have huge noise problems. Let's say you have a landscape shot that includes a blue sky. And in the blue sky, there are no clouds whatsoever. There's no birds, there's just blue sky. How much, quote unquote, useful detail is there in your blue sky? Is there any texture in it? Is there? Not typically, there shouldn't be, right? So that if you're going to sharpen it, and the default setting sharpens everything, well, anything that's in that sky is going to get exaggerated. That means any noise that your camera happens to be putting in there, if you have sensor dust specks that are in there, they're going to be emphasized and all that. So why not? Anytime you have a huge expanse of blue sky, why not take that masking slider under sharpening, bring it up a little bit till the sky turns black in that preview. You hold on Option, bring it up. Sky turns black, you know you're not exaggerating that area that has no useful detail. So the sharpening can't really be useful there.